on this particular show. Some of the things that I've done is, first, I found a drawing or a picture that I liked of a particular shaped bird, and I created a pattern or a drawing that I'm going to transfer onto my canvas. Once I've taken this drawing, first I located, and I found the center of my canvas, which I marked with a little dot just above the bird's head. That's where I want to make sure that I place the bird just below center canvas with the top of his head. Then I used graphite, which is a transfer paper, and I position the bird wherever I want it and tape it into place, and then I use a pencil or a stylus and draw the design, transferring it on the canvas. Once I've done that, I used scissors and I cut out a paper drawing of that same pattern. Now I like to use adhesive back paper, but you can use regular typing paper. Cut out a similar shape using that same drawing, and I've left the legs on this particular bird to keep them slender. And then I cut out around it, and I have an adhesive back one already placed on my canvas. Now let me peel this up and show you exactly what's happened. You can use Scotch tape. Whoops, I pressed it down so well. See if I can get, there it comes. There it comes off. You can see my drawing is underneath, and then I have a adhesive back paper that I've pressed over the drawing, matching them up. This is going to allow me to block in the background and work more rapidly for the show. What I've done already also is use my large 2.5-inch brush, and I took some of my basic white, which is a soft, creamy oil white base formula, and I squeezed it into a little dish, or you can put it right on your palette, and mixed a little ochre in it. In other words, I've creamed it. I'm not using it on its pure white. Come up here and let me show you the mix. I put a touch of ochre, and you can see the golden glow to the white, and that's fresh white that I put out. I've covered the entire canvas around the bird. I left this area unpainted, but right next to it I've already put on some to show you how I'm going to use this creamy color, and having this pattern cut out, I'm going to go right over it, and it'll kind of disappear for you, but it'll still be there, and work this over the entire surface of the canvas. This basic white is my helper and allows me a nice, easy movement of my paints as I build the composition. Once again, this is toned to a little bit of an off-white color. That's going to help create the contrast and make the bird stand out a lot lighter. As I progress in the painting, I'm going to be using a mixture of alizarin crimson and phthalo green as the foundation colors for this composition. Alizarin crimson and phthalo green happen to mix together to make a nice neutral gray, which is very nice for this kind of misty Everglades type effect. Let's go down to the palette for a minute, and let's add to the brush a little bit of alizarin crimson, which you can see is your deep, rich, vibrant red. And to that, let's add some of that phthalo green mix. And by the time you mix the two together in about equal amounts, you're going to get kind of a grayish tone to the color. It's a beautiful neutral type gray, and I'm not over mixing it into the brush. Let's go up to the canvas and start establishing a line or a band of color that's just above the bird's back. Now I'm just tapping this in. Sometimes I get little pinkish effects, but I'm going to start tapping and lifting up gently just to start establishing the foundation. If I turn the brush vertically and just kind of tap on the left side, I'm going to get a little bit of a loose, bushy effect and bring that down, kind of a reflection type in the water. We have to establish a contrast, a building of colors so the bird will have something to stand out against. As I streak this, I'm going to go right down over that pattern and establish this soft color first, so I get that effect where the bird will have at least some soft tones. Notice I'm streaking, allowing lines to happen. This creates more interest. We want a little more color on the top, so we'll come up a little higher onto the canvas, and we'll start tapping a little taller over on the right as we work up, and sometimes I just gently crisscross and fade that in, letting it gently blur or melt into the existing colors. Nothing distinctive at this stage. I have to build my colors gradually. I like to tell my students, don't pile the paint on too quickly. You can always add more paint as you build more carefully, and then you can make your colors darker and enhance the painting without losing control of all the paint that you've put on. Let's go back down to the palette for a minute and add another mixture of this, more phthalo with some more alizarin, making it a little richer or darker. Now that gets that a little heavy on the phthalo. I need a little more alizarin in that to neutralize it and come up with this kind of lavender color. Once again, I'm leaving this color a little marbled in its effect without over mixing. This is darker, richer, and we're going back up to the canvas, and we're going to strengthen that line across the bird's back again. This is the distant Everglades effect. Notice how dark that is and how light the other appears. As you build gradually like this, it allows you to watch your changes and compare and see how one color will affect another color. And I'm just kind of tapping, giving a very impressionistic effect of these shrubs or bushes or whatever they are. Maybe they're swamp pines. Sometimes I pull on them. That'll give them a little mossy look. And variety. That's what I'm looking for. Lots of variety. A little of this interest in the water. I want his head and all to stand out well, so I'll pull some of that down so I have more contrast area. Making sure not to neglect the area around the legs and all. Since I want the legs to be a dark, this is a snowy egret, and they have dark legs, then I'm going to go ahead and make sure I don't get too dark in there. That way the dark will show out against the lighter water. One more time, we'll go into the paints and strengthen that mix. Alizarin crimson, phthalo green. If you really want to gray it down and make it even darker, you could add some Van Dyke brown to it. But I kind of hold off on that at these early stages. Notice on my palette how dark and rich the color is, almost mixing up to a black. I haven't cleaned my brush yet, so I just go right up to the canvas and once again concentrate on these areas of contrast, especially right across that line. Each time seems to be a little enriched or darker. Tapping that in, that's got a little heavy on the phthalo, but that's okay. Tapping in variety of colors, making sure I don't form too hard of a line. And then I'm going to switch brushes for a minute. Since I have so much paint on there, let's take a 1-inch brush, a foliage brush, and we'll soften that. This is the options you have. If you get a little too much color, a dry brush makes for a nice, simple blender. Just going to kind of catch that every once in a while and just kind of tap it with a little bit of a poking stroke and let those colors flow into there a little softer. So anything that becomes too defined, I kind of have a tendency to melt it in or soften it down. I like soft edges. This particular composition is a little bit of a vignette. You'll notice I haven't gone to the edge of the canvas. I'm keeping this very subtle around the edges so I get a little vignetted effect. I believe I'm getting a good contrast in this area that's going to make the bird pop out of there when we're ready to paint him, and we need plenty of time for him. But if necessary, I'll switch to a fan brush, and with the fan brush I'm going to be able to go ahead and stay more in control of that one little area. Let's go back down to the palette for a moment. Add a little Van Dyke brown to the same mix that I had. Maybe a touch more alizarin. This will give me placement control as I go up to the canvas and right across that line. Once again, this is the little bird's back. I'll scratch out right near the edge of the pattern so you can kind of see where that pattern is located. It's pretty well lost under all that paint, but he'll pop out of there when we need him. Okay, and darkening in these areas. Occasionally just a little poke with a flip down, and those might be marshy type of water oaks or something back there in the distance. Okay, just keeping it simple. You can build, 3 or 4 layers of coloring on here. Keep it where you're not going in for the detail of the background. A few liner brush strokes with your liner brush will maybe give an indication of some trunks. Although this is where, save that for the last part. I'm going to put a few simple suggestions, but if you just don't get carried away with this, if you have more time at home, you'll realize that if you need to, you can go back. Then just bring a few little lines back up in there, just for the tall stalks or the trunk lines of a few of them. Sometimes I leave this step out completely, or if it gets too strong, I just hit it with my finger and let it tone down just slightly. Maybe there's an old one that's leaning where one tree has already fallen. Nothing too detailed. A little wiggle down in the water almost gives a little reflection of a trunk occasionally. So these are just interesting things that can happen. A water line in the distance will add the separation between the land and the water. I like to do that with a palette knife. So we'll go to a palette knife, and with the palette knife I'll use titanium white. I alternate between thick and thin paints for the simple reason one will apply differently than the other. This being titanium is my thicker bodied paint than the basic that I started with, and it will allow the paint to be in more control. I'm going to come right back here in the distance where the clearing is in the trees and just tap a little bit of a line back through there. It's kind of broken, not hard and straight. A few little glints of light on the water in the distance. Trying not to overdo. If I have to, I go back and occasionally I'll even put a little bit of light on 2 of the stalks of the trees. Maybe the light's filtering through and hitting that. If I need to, I can brush it. Okay, what we've done is establish a good foundation that we can build on that will allow contrast for our egret to stand out. So you develop your paintings more slowly and, of course, keeping this in mind. Contrast is most important to make a vibrant painting. I have a little specialty brush, a little fan brush that I find is very nice to soften little lines or clumps of paint. So I'm going to go up to the canvas and just using this little soft bristle brush, just kind of catch the paint and stretch it. You find if there's a little clump of paint there and you pull horizontally, it will elongate or pull that paint just enough to make it stretch out. If you overdo it, just brush it in and then go back and repeat the step. Before I remove the pattern and start work on the bird, I want to establish that branch that he's perched on. We're going to go to the liner brush for that, and I have to clean it to remove the dark purple color, and we're going to go in with just some burnt umber. Now watch how I do this. This is a clean liner brush, dipped into your odorless thinner, and we're going down to our palette to some burnt, no, excuse me, not using burnt umber this time, I'm using Van Dyke brown. That's your gray brown. That's a dark, rich, almost a black brown that's going to allow that to be very neutral when it mixes with that base white on the canvas. Okay, I'm making a puddle down on my palette of your Van Dyke and thinner. I have a little mini palette over here that I'm going to also use, which has the same paint, but I won't have to go back in front of the camera as often, so I'm going to do the same thing on my little portable palette. So I have two sources that I can work from. Okay, let's go to the canvas. Now there is a piece of paper that goes over part of the pattern. I'm going to just outline it for you. It's no sense painting it because it's going to be removed, but that's the start of the trunk line that will get filled in. From that, I'm going to start extending and just kind of lay the brush down on the paper and drag it with a little bit of a wiggle, and then I start lifting off as I allow that to taper or narrow and get this textured, almost rough look to this old dead branch that the bird is perched on. If you keep your paint thin enough, they'll flow off, and you have to allow the point to come right off the canvas as you lift away and get almost like a narrow type of effect. An old dead branch coming there. Then we're going to come to the other side, and we form a little bit of a U that's going to run up the close vignetted edge just behind the tail of the bird. And I'm going to kind of hold my hand down so you can see this, and just drag that brush over as I just kind of wobble it up, if I can get out of the way. Reloading occasionally my little mini palette, and just bring that old dead branch hanging in there. I'm lifting off. Very difficult to work from the bottom up. Maybe if I just hold my hand this side, I can filter it out a little bit. Little, delicate, snarly old branches. Now, there has to be a connection here where there's a log or branch where this all comes down. And I'm just going to kind of block it in with, of course, whoops, there's a heavy little pad of paint that I didn't thin enough. Let's get a little more thinner in there. Keep that paint flowing. Block it in, connect the two, and have a trunk line that kind of heads down out of the painting. Now, as I'm just stretching that paint, it's mixing with the white, and I'm just kind of stirring it in, allowing lights and darks and values to happen. It gets interesting. Different things happen right there on the canvas. To lose the harshness of this edge, I use my finger. That's one of the most inexpensive brushes you can get a hold of, but it blends out, and I just kind of smear it and just let it fade gently out of the composition. Remembering that I want a vignetted effect. You don't want to pull all the way off the canvas. If you need a little more color inches, pick up a little more paint and tap in a few little texturing effects in the bark. Now you can see how I've just blocked this in. We're going to have some moss hanging down on the branch, so we could depict that right now while we've got our brush loaded. Let's just use that same brush and just kind of brush and pull straight down some streaky lines, like you're brushing hair. This is that old dry moss that hangs up. And I'm just kind of dragging the brush, pulling little lines down at different areas. We'll put some contrast colors on top of it, but it sure has the effect that I want it to have. Just touch on, whoops, that went past the branch. I have to add a branch to hold it up. Okay, nice and gently done, not a lot of paint, and just streak it, pulling vertically so the moss fills that full of gravity. Now let's remove that pattern, and then we can see what we can do with the bird as we develop the painting. Once again, I move fairly quickly on the show, so I have to be careful not to leave out some of the important steps. I will admit that I need to go back sometimes and enhance these effects, but covering all the basics, I think, will give you an idea of what you can build on. So So that's what I'm really trying to do more than anything else. I'm using the palette knife wiped off, and I'm going to lift under the belly of the pattern and peel it off. As you can see, that's going to leave underneath the dry canvas. And let's go underneath the little branch area. Have to really kind of, whoops, well, I'll show you how to fix that one. Let's lift this off. Got to get his little leg. Boy, I pressed that down so well, I almost didn't want to remove. There we go. Here's a good thing. Now that it's happened, let me show you how we would touch up around the legs of the bird. You need to check sometimes. I'm going to go with this little mini brush, fan brush, or even a small number 16, clean and dry. Whatever brush you decide to use, make sure it's clean and dry. And I'll go in and I'll follow the stroke lines, and I'll actually paint into the object that I'm going to haven't painted yet, and pull that paint into it. If you came in real close, you'd see there's a couple of areas right outside the bird's legs that really should have, this is my drawing now, paint outside of it. So I would rather paint into this, and that would allow me to paint back over it. In other words, I don't want raw canvas outside of the bird's silhouette, or he'll have to get fat or bow-legged. So we've got to make sure that the paint's in the right areas at this stage. You can always paint the bird bigger, but it's tough to get him smaller. It's like going on a diet. It's almost impossible to do to get that weight off. So you want to keep that in mind when you're painting. You want to make sure you put the paint in the right spots because it's tough to get off. Okay, let's lay in a foundation for the bird. I'm going to switch brushes again to get a nice effect with the number 16 flat. Now this number 16s, these are sable bristle brushes that work so well for me. They come in different lengths. They're both number 16, although they look different. One of them has shorter bristles. They're a mixture of a badger type bristle, but they're very flexible, very soft. They're not coarse, hard brushes like we're going to use maybe in a few other shows to block that in. So we're going to have to establish the foundation of the body of the bird in different values or colors before we pull in the detail. So we get an initial lay of paint on the canvas to build up on. And painting in oils, wet on wet, we want to make sure we don't put excessive paint on too soon. Okay, let's go up, let's go down to the palette first. And I think we're going to start with a little bit of your titanium white with a little of your background color. This has got your phthalo green in it. And I'm just going really into the mixing spot I had, adding some white to it. This is going to give me a coloring that's going to be kind of shadowed on the bird. And I'm going to come up to and underneath the wing of the bird. So I'm just going to slide the brush and block in and underline some of the body sections that were already established. Kind of going over the lines, you might say. There should be a kind of a shadow on his neck, so I'm going to come under his neckline as I bring in this little bit of dark. Now he looks kind of funny right now, but remember, we're laying in a color that we're going to be mixing into later, and this is where I want you to realize it. That we have to build slowly, slowly adding paints until we get to the desired effect. Before I get too caught up on the body of the bird, I need to establish the beak. Now I'm going to do something that might prove interesting for you. I'm going to establish a blue heron bird by putting in ochre for his beak, but I'll make a snowy egret out of him by putting black over it. So that's just to show you, you can change your mind. The reason I want to start with a little bit of yellow ochre with thinner on my brush is to come up to the canvas and go over his legs and his beak and his mask area. Now this is a thin wash of paint that as I block it in with a liner brush, gives me a little detail and control. This would be the heron with the light-colored beak and legs. But when I go back over it and paint the dark back over it, the character of the bird changes and he becomes a egret, with a snowy egret in particular. I'm going to go over his legs, and you need a steady hand, so take your time when you're doing this. And you should be able to see the lines of your pattern through the thin layer of paint. Now I've got to go back and establish that branch, but do you know why I haven't done that at this stage? It's because I can always pull the branch back over his feet and then, you know, repeat the steps. So it makes it a little easier. Okay, so now at this stage, this happens to be a heron because he has light-colored legs and beak. But we will make it black in a minute. I want that to set up. That's going to give a little bit of coloring showing through that puts a little highlight on the beak, which is interesting. Okay, let's go back to that number 16 brush, and I'm going to start using titanium white. I wiped it out, down to the palette, and I'm going to use just titanium white and block in the back of the bird, and really just establishing the basic form. It's picking up a little of the color, but that's so I can still see the contrast. Because I started out with that creamy tone of an off-white, not a pure white, on the background, it helped me create a contrast so the white actually appears whiter. So this is what you want to remember. Don't start off with a white canvas or your bird will never really stand out quite enough. I'm blocking him in, his area around his head, and getting just enough paint on there that I'll be able to work more color on top of it. I'm not applying paint heavily. Now I'm going to begin to just kind of tap into the last coloring and let the two colors merge gently. It's kind of a pat blend type of effect, and it softens the harshness of the lines between the two colors. And allowing, notice how, see how that harshness disappears? It adds form to your object, creating the shadow and the lights together. Now leaving a little of his belly unpainted at this stage, just tapping, wiping the brush occasionally. Okay. There we go. You can see how he's shaping up, and these different values or colors help create the form of the bird. I want to create a nice glow under his belly, kind of a light backlight effect. I'm going to use pink, just because it's pretty, and white and red mixed together for a nice little bright pink, and we're going to go up to and underneath his belly area and lay in a little of this pink. Whoops, got a little bit of a bulge on his stomach. Just enough to soften underneath that. Now I wipe the brush, and once again, start tapping very gently, wiping that brush often to keep the paint from being excessive. Now I have to pull that little area of his front leg in. Once again, what I'm trying to achieve at this stage is a block-in. Detail comes in the final stages. In any composition you're working on, you should concern yourself with placement, with your general mass areas of where your sky is, where the water is, all these type of things. Then develop it in the form shape with your lights, your shadows, and your highlights. That gives form to any object that you work on. Then the last step is detail. So I'm looking at a block-in right now, and that's what I hope you will remind yourself, not to get hung up on detail before it's ready. Okay, I need to take just a little more titanium white from my palette and tap in that little thigh bone right there and bring that little bit of light right there. And underneath the bird, you wouldn't want to bring a highlight. And then we're going to go back and block in the rest of the log. Okay, have to switch to the liner to do that. You know, it's funny, I could use the number 16 to block in that little log, but I find that the liner keeps me a little loose and free as I'm blocking that in. And I can just lay the brush down and almost tap that on for a little texturing. You don't have to put the paint on heavily. This is something I stress to my students. If you need more, you apply more. I like the creamy, easy-moving paints that I've designed because that way I stay more in control by putting less on. And this is where you'll get comfortable with what works for you, and I know a soft, easy-moving paint is what does what I want it to. So each paint is designed differently, so you have to keep that in mind. That's all. You'll find that one will do a job one way, and another will do a job another way. Okay, I'm back down on the palette right now with some more of the Van Dyke. Sometimes I like to, well, let's change. Let's add a little phthalo green to that brush, into the Van Dyke, and come back in and add a little color interest. Tap a little of that phthalo green, that's in our background, and put a little shadow color interest in there. Just blocking it in. I'm going to use my finger just to make sure I get rid of some of those white spots. There we go. Just cool introduction of that color so it balances with the background. Keeps an even flow going. That's what sometimes I like to finger paint more than I like to use a brush. It depends on the effect that I'm trying to achieve. Okay, we need to start concentrating on his little eye, and I'm going to go back to my little mini palette, keep a little palette here that I can pick up, and I'm going to have to very carefully mix up a black, and that's going to be with alizarin and phthalo with a touch of the Van Dyke, and let's make a snowy egret. That's what I call this one, a snowy egret. That's because his beak is a black beak, and that's that characteristic. Actually, their little feet are golden color, but they look like they have on bedroom slippers. But I'm going to go back over this, and you'll see how there's a knee joint there you want to concern yourself with. In the book, I have a more detailed drawing, so you can really get the character of the actual bird. Pull that down over, and let's darken his legs, and that gives even more contrast. I'm going to block in his beak. Now the mask area around the eye, let's dot his little eye there so you get a little character. And you can see how I changed the character of the bird. He no longer is a heron, due to they look very similar, but I now have an egret with that contrast. And a little bit of ochre that's on there helps depict that as a little bit of a glow. Okay, a little of that phthalo green light on the mosses, just kind of tap it in and pull it down for color interest. Sometimes even a little basic white. Just bring a little highlight on the log and all. And you could spend a lot of time working on this, and I hope you've gotten an idea of how to use patterns. Maybe I'll spend a little time on detail of some structure of some feathers with just some little white, little movements of feather strokes, little highlight on his back, building up to the pure white. Now I'm just using a little basic, a little bright up on his wing back, on the top of his head. Stretch that contrast. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you do try this one.
To get your Paint with Pittard 2 step-by-step instructional guide by Lynne Pittard, send $14.95, check or money order to Paint with Pittard 2, P.O. Box 1713, Department G, Delray Beach, Florida, 33483, or call 1-800-942-4000. Please have your MasterCard, Visa, or American Express card handy. That's $14.95, check or money order to Paint with Pittard 2, P.O. Box 1713, Department G, Delray Beach, Florida, 33483. Price includes postage and handling. This 72-page full-color guide contains the 13 paintings shown in this series.
Art is fun for you.
Next on Channel 2, Julia Child and Company, The Victory Garden at 4:30. And don't forget tonight's premieres, The World at War and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Begin at 8. Don't miss.
Your friends can try it too. It's always up to you. Just try it, you'll like it, 'cause art is fun for you.
Paint with Pittard 2 with Lynne Pittard was made possible by a grant from Langnickel Artists Brushes and Graphics Plus of Florida, Incorporated, publishers of educational and instructional materials.
Here at WGBH, our goal is to make every family a member of our family. But we're still one family short, and guess who's missing? That's right, you. Only you can help guarantee that WGBH will continue to bring your family the very best that television has to offer. So please join our family today. Rush your check to WGBH, Boston.